Good morning, welcome to the first session of today. My name is Pedro Cana, I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm pleased to introduce my co-chair, my friend Nikos Dedes. Nikos is a very well-known activist from the European AIDS Treatment Group, and he is a fan of early treatment as I am, so I'm very pleased to be here with him. So without further ado, Nikos will introduce our first panelist who will take a position in the debate.
So as you know, today we will have a debate on whether treatment as prevention works in men who have sex with men, and we have two debaters, and it's my pleasure to introduce David Evans, who is a community educator and activist from California. He is going to tell us and convince us of why treatment as prevention works in the setting of men who have sex with men. We will have 10 minutes for each speaker, and then there will be 5 minutes rebuttals and then open discussion.
Thanks, Nikos. So I'm not here today as a scientist because I'm actually not one. But for over 20 years, I've been a community educator, and for the last 15, I've been a science activist working on prevention and treatment, giving input on clinical trials, advocating for funding and structures to support the science, and translating that science into public policy. I am here because of the science, for sure, but I'm also here to introduce a human element to this really important debate. I have a rather formidable job, which is to debate my estimable colleague here, Myron Cohen. I've been telling colleagues over the last couple of weeks that I was going to do this, and every single one of them gave me that look of, oh, you are a crazy man. Yes, exactly. I am David. I don't have any stones in my pocket, though, I promise. So, to get a little more serious for a second, I first want to say that when it comes to treatment as prevention, for men who have sex with men, and frankly for anybody, the first right that we have to accord people is the right to refuse treatment. And we have to respect that right, even though we may not always understand it. I also have to say that I hate the term test and treat, because it somehow implies that anybody who decides not to treat is less intelligent or less morally valid in terms of their desire to take care of themselves or others. And frankly, no offense, but I also hate the term treatment as prevention a little bit, or TasP, because in some cases it could also imply that the prevention benefits are more important than the treatment benefits, but it's what we've got, so that's what I'll stick with. I want to say I am not going to argue that if we get every MSM who tests positive on treatment tomorrow, that we're going to shut down the epidemic. I think that would be an absolutely absurd claim. And we simply don't have the data or the modeling work that would support that claim. But what I am here to do are argue 3 simple points. So the first point is that there do exist biological data strongly suggesting that reductions in the virus do actually result in potentially reductions in new infections among MSM and their ability to transmit HIV to others. Second, I want to say that a true combination approach with TasP as a centerpiece does stand the chance of substantially altering the trajectory of the epidemic in MSM. And thirdly, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why I'm here as opposed to somebody else, I want to argue that there is an individual and a societal imperative to act on this information. And so to the first point. Ever since we began conducting rectal challenge, SIV, and SHIV studies in non-human primates, it's been abundantly clear that the size of the inoculum is directly correlated with both the rate and the risk of infections. This is a biological reality. Less virus equals fewer infections. Yes, receptive unprotected anal sex is an order of magnitude more risky than unprotected vaginal sex. But that said, the math still adds up. And even though HIV RNA in blood does not always correlate to HIV in semen, undetectable RNA levels in blood have thus far predicted immensely strong prevention benefits in both HPTN-052 and in the cohort studies that preceded it. But what about the real-world evidence? There were relatively few MSM in the 052 study, leaving us little to no randomized controlled data upon which to draw a conclusion. The partner in the opposites attract studies, which are ongoing or soon to be ongoing, 2 randomized controlled studies of TasP in MSM, will hopefully offer us more guidance in the coming years, but it's going to be a while. And given the high percentage of MSM who engage in sex outside of relationships, I think we should be very cautious to expect too much from either one of those studies. So that leaves us with best guess estimates coming from city and countrywide surveillance surveys, incidence surveys that are partnered with ART coverage and average viral loads in the community. It can be argued that real-world application of test and treat strategies will not shut down the epidemic alone. The reasons vary, but include the fact that sexual networks and partner concurrency result in a substantial number of transmissions coming from individuals during undiagnosed primary infection. Data from the UK suggests that simply testing more frequently isn't going to reduce incidence. However, the current HIV treatment practices in the UK, which do not favor early treatment and in fact have been somewhat hostile to the notion of early treatment, combined with low rates of PEP and almost nobody on PrEP, really do render that data problematic in trying to assess whether TasP might work. There are positive data coming out of France and Denmark and elsewhere, but given that my time is limited today, I'm going to focus on the San Francisco experience because that's where I'm from. So the epidemic in San Francisco is almost solely MSM. 73% of new infections are from sex between men, and 15% of new infections are from sex between men who also happen to be injection drug users. In 2004, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention began a systematic estimate of HIV incidence among MSM in San Francisco and other cities. And there have been 2 subsequent surveys in 2008 and 2011. And during that period, the percentage of unrecognized infection in people who were randomly tested in venue-based sampling decreased from 20% to 6%. And the number of people who had been tested within the previous 6 months increased from 44% to 60%, or nearly 60%. So we're certainly on our way to the goal of reducing unrecognized infection in San Francisco, but granted, we still have a ways to go. Also encouraging is that during that same period, data from other sources found that the lag time from infection or from testing positive to having 80% of people on treatment reduced from 5 years to under 2 years. And that the average CD4 count upon ARV and initiation rose from 364 to 515. So given that San Francisco adopted a test and treat approach in 2010, I think those numbers have likely accelerated. At the same time, surveys of sexual behavior among MSM indicate that HIV risks among both HIV positive and HIV negative men have continued to remain at high levels. As well, rates of STDs among MSM, particularly rectal STDs, have significantly risen during that time period, and the level of risk is substantial. So yet, despite these high levels of reported risk and high rates of STDs, HIV incidence has not risen in tandem in San Francisco, as it did toward the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. In fact, there's been a trend toward a decrease in incidence. Incidence was 2.6 in 2004 and fell to just 1% by 2011. Granted, this did not reach statistical significance, but we were tantalizingly close with a p-value of 0.06. So are we there yet? Absolutely not. Are we headed in the right direction? I would argue that we definitely are. With expanded testing, combination ARTIS prevention, PEP and PrEP, we could go from yearly increases in new infections among MSM in the United States to at minimum a stabilizing of infections and hopefully a decrease in infections for the first time since the early 1990s. So what do we do with the information we currently have? Is the status quo sufficient until the partner or opposites attract studies demonstrate the prevention benefit of ART between men? How long do we wait, and what exactly are we waiting for? One of the most poignant fears I've heard researchers give is that widespread knowledge of the prevention benefits of treatment as prevention may lead to risk compensation. But so far, I have yet to see that fear realized in the literature. In fact, what little research does exist suggests that people living with HIV are among the most skeptical of believing that an undetectable RNA level in blood automatically translates to less infectiousness. Another concern about TasP is the large percentage of new infections that come from individuals during very early infection. While this certainly dilutes the potential of TasP, I don't see that it actually changes anything regarding our intention to use TasP as a new prevention tool. Whether we use TasP or not, we still need to do more frequent testing. We must still employ social network testing and partner services, both of which can be utilized even in low and middle income countries. In high income countries, even more can be done to try and recognize individuals in acute infection. All of this we could do and should do regardless of TasP, and all of these would enhance its value. So let's be clear, we have come pretty close to the limit of the efficacy of behavioral prevention strategies for either HIV positive or HIV negative men. We got people to use seatbelts only because we made it illegal to not do so. And disgracefully, we've already made it illegal in some parts for HIV-positive people to engage in any kind of sex with HIV-negative people without first disclosing HIV status. Some laws go even beyond this, and we are ruefully reaping the negative consequences of this approach. I also doubt that there are structural interventions likely to have large-scale effects in MSM. So we definitely need something new. TasP is that something, and I don't believe that it is either right or moral to wait for the data to catch up to begin implementing this important strategy. So let's go to the red herring, that anybody is suggesting that TasP alone is going to shut down the epidemic, and instead have a reasoned conversation, not about whether we ought to try it, but how we ought to try it. Let's do our best to determine the degree to which it has an impact, where it has an impact, and what the ideal cluster of prevention approaches ought to be for specific populations. I said earlier that I'd introduce a human element, and so I'm not just a science advocate and educator. I'm also a gay man who has lived under the shadow of HIV since I was a teenager. For me, there was no pre-AIDS period. I'm not HIV positive, but I have been in relationships with wonderful men who were. And HIV was always, always an unwelcome intruder, not only in the physical sense in terms of our sex lives, but in the psychic sense in terms of the emotional connection that we could make and the level of intimacy that millions of people take for granted. I've also led hundreds of groups with thousands of gay men over the years, and I've heard exactly the same thing from them that I've heard from my partners. I do believe I have an understanding of what TasP means to the individual, but just to be safe, I did reach out before this meeting to one of the smartest HIV-positive guys I know who just absolutely knows all of the prevention data. And I asked him what he thinks TasP does mean to the individual who's living with HIV. And this is what he said. First, that it removes a lot of the fear of disclosure. Second, that it removes a lot of the fear of not disclosing. Third, that it may enable a person to have relationships at all. Fourth, it's a piece of positive self-management that changes for the better the way a person responds to their own HIV status. Fourth, and this one's huge, in the long run, it may make HIV a less feared and stigmatized condition. We all know the role that stigma plays in making all of our programs work less well. And lastly, that TasP could one day make a person less liable to criminalization, eventually, hopefully, when the laws catch up. So for many guys, TasP is truly a game changer. And to pretend that it's not would be to do them all a great disservice. So, thank you.
Thank you, David, for this interesting talk. Our next speaker is Myron Cohen. As you know, Mike is professor of medicine at the University of North Carolina. Of note, he was not sure if he was called to be for or against in this debate, which proves that Mike, on top of being a brilliant scientist, is a big debater.
Very flexible.
Yeah, very flexible.
Well, I think David did an excellent job, but yet I must dissect this, and so I apologize in advance. I think during the discussion we'll have to discuss causation and incidence, those two words, because they're quite important. And I guess my main goal is to focus on one issue, and that is to provide the data that we have available to us about the probability that we can interfere with the transmission of HIV through receptive anal intercourse. I think we have to get this away from MSM in a sense, okay? While I realize the importance of that population, key population, this is about receptive anal intercourse. And what we're really focused on is the efficiency of transmission during receptive anal intercourse, and whether, as we provide ART, what degree of confidence we can currently have to interfere with that process. I won't change my own position, and this is important, that we should treat everybody immediately, regardless of, in other words, from my point of view, this argument we're having is about managing expectations, so that policymakers, when they actually see reality, aren't arguing that we've deluded them into believing a thing is going to happen that's not going to happen based on the data available that I'll present to you with slides, since that would be impossible for me to talk without slides. Now, so the managing of expectations and anal intercourse, and what do we actually know? We have biological limitations of this process. We have a lot of surveillance data that demonstrates to us some very substantial failures that we didn't anticipate. We've got the contribution of STDs, whether in gay men or in heterosexual couples. And the STDs are important for a couple of reasons. It's almost impossible for us to argue about risk compensation and see rising STDs and argue that condoms are being used at the same rate. Those are almost incompatible in these populations. So as we see rising STDs, we're going to get into two problems. That in fact condoms are being used less, which is an argument the British are going to provide to us, and that the STDs are going to overwhelm the benefits of ART. A thing we're very much afraid of, and I'll show you the data that helps to support that concern. And lastly, you really quickly wrote off acute infection, which is actually pretty inconsistent with the data. So we'll talk about acute infection as we go along. And so the goal here is, again, to look at the data we have available to manage expectations. So first of all, we agree that HIV transmission through unprotected anal intercourse is very efficient. It's much more efficient than the other routes of transmission for pretty moderately well understood biological reasons. The mucosa of the anus has a lot of differentiated cells that are prepared to receive HIV with a lot of receptors per cell, and it turns out that the rectal mucosa is very fragile. As we've done explant studies, it's been kind of shocking to see that you can take, and I want to say this in a way that offends almost nobody, I'll offend somebody with this one, you can take a vaginal biopsy and pound it with a hammer, and it looks great. And you take a piece of rectal mucosa and it falls apart before you ever get it into the tissue culture. And this has become a really big problem for explant studies. So if that's offensive, I didn't mean it to be, but it had to be. This is a debate. It has to be funny. So the rectal mucosa is very fragile. Rebecca, I think this is one of two studies that are probably important. This is by Katie Barr, and it just shows, maybe not surprisingly, that during receptive anal intercourse, and again, this is an unreadable slide, and I apologize, but so just you'll have to trust what I'm about to tell you, that during receptive anal intercourse, the number of variants that are acquired, and we can count the number of variants, is higher than in vaginal intercourse. What do I mean by that? In vaginal intercourse, 82% of the people have acquired one virus. The median's one, or two. But in receptive anal intercourse, we have a broader range, meaning there are more receptive cells available. We're seeing the kind of evidence that the tissue is more available for HIV transmission. Rebecca Bagley did a very nice job at summarizing a very high probability of transmission with a single episode of intercourse. Heterosexual intercourse, there's no way it's per act 1.4%, but she estimates from a meta-analysis that it's 1.4%, and that per partner transmission during partnerships would be as high as 40%. So when we look at the numbers in the literature, which are very confusing about heterosexual transmission efficiency and rectal, it's wrong to call it heterosexual, penile vaginal versus receptive anal, that receptive anal is incredibly more efficient, and I think that's generally agreed upon. The antiviral drugs are a problem for us. We spent a lifetime, our group, led by Angela Kashuba, and other groups have spent a lot of time trying to understand the distribution of drugs in tissues. And we really don't completely understand the distribution of most of the antiretroviral drugs in rectal tissue, and this is becoming an increasing problem for us. There's issues of metabolism and penetration, of sustainability, and I won't go into this in detail, but it's a really important topic that would constrain the ability of treatment in an HIV-infected person having an uninfected exposure rectally. It constrains the rectum. And HIV replicates in compartments differently. The replication so you'll find different variants replicating in the anus and in the blood on occasion, demonstrating there's some sort of compartmentalization that really is important for us to understand as researchers in order to understand, again, managing expectations. So one of the themes that I'm getting at here is that it is extreme, and we talked about this the first day during the dinner. We're at a meeting of a lot of people who believe treatment will serve as prevention very broadly. But we cannot underestimate the importance of doing continued research in these areas to try and understand how to manage this problem and how to actually realize the benefits we would anticipate. Now, one thing that is really not widely recognized is that when we treat you with an antiretroviral drug, the typical 3-drug combinations, and then we look in the seminal plasma, so now we're talking about, for example, an HIV-positive person who we're treating, we don't sterilize the semen. We find blips, not infrequently, of HIV in the semen by any assay we do. And in women, it's worse. About a quarter of the female genital tract, we never really sterilize, not with antiretroviral drugs. So it's a compartment phenomenon. Now, is there enough virus there, and is it viable enough to cause infection? The virus is going to go to the next person in semen bathed in antiretrovirals. So if I took his side of the argument, I'd say, whoa, how's that ever going to cause infection? But nevertheless, it's important to realize you don't sterilize the semen with current regimens of antiretrovirals. And these, by the way, are just a series of articles, and there's more that demonstrate this. You will not eliminate HIV in the rectum with antiretrovirals. So we treat you, you're sterile in your blood, less than 400 copies, but when we start biopsying your rectum, intermittently we can find HIV. Is it viable? Is it contagious? We don't know. Another important research question for the future. And also important to the cure AIDS field, because if we're going to cure AIDS, we have to sterilize every compartment, as would be obvious. Sexually transmitted diseases are a huge problem. They act to cause inflammation and ulceration. They increase viral shedding in both the rectum and the semen if the rectum is infected or the urethra is infected. And they act as a marker for increased risk behaviors. And we've already heard that in most of the epidemics we're witnessing, we're seeing this argument, well, that ART is being used more broadly and that there's no risk compensation, and yet we're seeing more and more syphilis and more LGV. Let me focus on Julio, his very province, which is always fun for me. My understanding, which you can accept or reject from Dr. Lester, is he here? Okay, Dr. Lester told me that something like the syphilis is now again rising, and that 70% of the people with syphilis are HIV infected. That's fine. You can have HIV down. But syphilis is rising. So we see then behavior changes opposite of what we'd prefer. We'd prefer less syphilis and less STDs. That's not really too personal. That's true. So moving along with this, many studies showing that STDs will amplify the risk of HIV transmission, and I won't go into all these studies. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them, and there are some studies that would try and indicate to us that STDs can overwhelm ART, that you start seeing blips in the face of an STD, even in a person whose blood is suppressed. Now, this is the most important part of this talk. This is reality. So we have two really important realities. And the UK was mentioned. Andrew Phillips published his paper just 3 weeks ago or a month ago. And Andrew Phillips's paper demonstrates that in the UK, granted that they don't have the most aggressive early treatment policy, that in the UK, as they claim 80% of MSM, that they've seen no fall in their incidence of HIV and MSM. And incidence as probably properly defined as incidence. And Andrew argues that condom usage has gone down and that people unaware of their status are transmitting HIV. He may or may not be right in that argument, but that's his explanation. Australia has a very similar phenomenon, broader treatment, earlier treatment. Still, they're not seeing the anticipated decline. Now, Andrew says in the absence of ART, there'd be much more HIV, and that's probably true. Nevertheless, manage expectations. And then there's acute infection. So if everything else I've said goes kind of, okay, well, maybe. During acute infection, you achieve the highest concentration of HIV. You've got a homogeneous virus that came from one person ready to go to another person. It's got a lot of advantages in transmission probability. And we have lots of evidence that HIV transmission among men who have sex with men for a variety of social reasons is clustered in networks. Some of it from the Canadians. So Brenna Blum and Mark Wainberg have been leaders in using molecular phylogeny to show that they see cluster, looking at gay men in Toronto, showing clusters of transmission. And they argue, I think, that about half of all the transmissions they saw in Toronto were clustered in a way that would suggest that acute infection, which we're not dealing with at all as we offer ART, acute infection is spreading the disease. Martin Fisher and Brighton had observed the same thing, as did Koutsos in the Swiss cohort. So ART and MSM, a summary. ART may reduce penile and HIV transmission in some settings. There's no doubt about it. But we have no direct measurements of HIV prevention ascribed to MSM. We just don't have data that can be used to unequivocally support that. The observational ecological data ought to raise great fear that there's something we don't understand. And again, manage expectations. Don't tell policymakers that if we do this, we're going to have a dramatic effect on the MSM part of this epidemic unless we understand this a little bit better. And even if ART does work to some extent to reduce such transmission probabilities, the combination of less condom use, increased risk behaviors, STIs, and access to people with acute infection may very well negate the benefits of treatment as prevention. So, bottom line of this, I think we should treat everybody immediately, including there's no doubt about that. I think we need much more research as it relates to receptive anal intercourse, whether in heterosexual or couples or other, and we should manage expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now we have the opportunity for David to do the rebuttal, if needed.
Sure.
Well, when we were setting up here, we were talking about typical debate tactics and pulling zingers out of the hat, and Mike was talking about quoting him. I won't quote him as times when he's argued in favor of this. I actually have a different quote. Some of our amazing colleagues here from KwaZulu-Natal can tell us that going from a 10% coverage to a 30 to 40% coverage resulted in a 38% drop in new infections. And at the time when Mike was interviewed about that, he called that a home run. So I guess the question I have is, what would be a home run with penile anal sex? Would it be a 50% reduction, a 10% reduction, or merely stabilizing things within communities where risk is exceptionally high? And I feel we too often, when it comes to managing expectations, measure our chance for success against a hypothetical vaccine of very high efficacy. And we don't have that, and we're not going to have that anytime soon. I do want to respond to the issue about rectal tissue and the impact that that might play on ongoing transmission. There was actually an interesting study, and I'm pretty sure it was out of the UK, where they asked men about their sexual practices, and then they tested them and they looked at the likelihood that the person was infected. And interestingly enough, the guys that said that they only ever topped their partners without condoms actually were less likely to become infected or be infected than guys who said they used condoms all the time. Now, granted, people will tell you what they think you want to hear, but nevertheless, that does, I think, speak to a little bit to what the chance of rectal transmission is and the risk involved there, although I do acknowledge the biological issues. In terms of managing expectations, though, I think the one thing that I want to say is we have to be very careful about what we say in rooms together as scientists and community people and in small groups where we're talking about policy and what we say publicly. Because I fear that even though Mike is talking about wanting to treat everybody, and I have a similar thrust in that I think treatment is a benefit to people regardless of the prevention benefits, I think we also have to be careful about what governments will pay for and the kinds of policies that will be implemented if we're openly discouraging about the chance for MSM to benefit or anybody to benefit from anal-penile transmission because of treatment. So that's really all I would have to say.
Mike?
Again, I guess I'm trying to decide what the fundamental issue is, because we know we want to treat people, so we've agreed on that. And the fundamental issue is what do we do to counsel people properly? And Nico, it's funny because Nico and I, many years ago, were in a Swiss debate of some sort, and we came down to the same issue. You bring up this, because in the end of the day, it is really important to tell people what you actually think, and how much we can support unprotected anal intercourse based on what we know and how much we have to be concerned about it. And that was what we discussed in whatever city we were in Mexico, many years ago. And the problem is we have not invested enough, in my opinion, and I'm being honest now, while I think we've invested way more than enough to say that the health benefit, in my mind, that the health benefit and the overall transmission benefit are sufficient to move in the direction we're moving. I don't know how to counsel individual patients about unprotected rectal intercourse, and I'm not focused on gay men. I'm focused on the practice itself. I would not disagree that it's less efficient, that you will reduce the efficiency with ART and bolt directions, but the question is you'd like to give people a very accurate estimate of risk. And the problem is and now I have to debate, you use data to support, like the San Francisco data, which may be completely true. True is not the right word. It may be compelling for a variety of reasons. It also falls flaw to ecological studies. Because in an ecological study, you only know who you got to see. So all of a sudden, you might find a suburb of San Francisco with a lot more people with HIV than you've ever seen. You know, there's a lot of problem with ecological data. There's a lot of problem with what's caused changes, and there's a lot of problem with new diagnosis versus incidence. Because incidence is what was seen in KwaZulu-Natal. They were studying 16,000 negative people going positive. Most of the data we get, unfortunately, is new diagnosis. And new diagnosis, of course, is very difficult to estimate when it occurred. So our ecological data set make it difficult for us to look at what data we have and know what to tell people, which is the real problem. Because you did get, I think very nicely, to the human aspect of this, which I think is a totally appropriate argument, but what do we actually tell people? And with what degree of vigor? And that's something for the audience to decide. You know, do we say to people, this is a resolved problem, we've studied this and we're done? Or do we say, here's the deal, here's the data we have and we're not sure? which is the whole purpose of this debate, in a sense. And I actually don't know the answer, so I will turn it over to Pedro to actually tell me the answer.
No, I am not here to give answers. You have been paid to give the answers. I am only being paid to convene this meeting with Nico.
The question of the debate is, so let's frame the question differently. Do we actually have an answer of what to tell people about unprotected anal intercourse? That's the real fundamental thing. If I argued effectively, you would leave saying, whoa, I'm not really sure. If you argued effectively, then I'm not sure what you actually really believe. So in debates, we're always like saying whatever, you know. Do you really believe you have enough data to confidently tell people what to do? That's the real issue, and it is an important issue, and it does affect policymakers. And I would love to hear from people in the audience what they actually believe.
Yeah,
Julio has very strong beliefs about everything. I'm very curious what he believes.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that one of the surveys that's been conducted found that only 17% of MSM engage in behaviors that actually put others at risk. So I think that understanding, and I completely support research, even though I was here to share the human element. I think we need to do a lot of focus groups. I think we need to really understand why guys are making those decisions, how they're making the decisions. We understand some of it. I think one of the mistakes that I hear sometimes put out there is that that's all alcohol fueled and crystal meth fueled, and it's not. And I think we need to do better jobs of talking about sex with people in the first place.
Yeah, one thing, I don't think this is a pet peeve, like you had a pet peeve about TasP. It's not about MSM, it's about receptive anal intercourse. To my knowledge, the CDC published a paper arguing that maybe as many as 1 in 5 heterosexual couples have receptive anal intercourse. Second, in the southeastern United States, there's a lot of women acquiring HIV. Some of that is almost certainly receptive anal intercourse. And so I think we need to look at the act and focus not like on stigmatizing a group and say, this particular act, what can we say about this act with respect to the benefits of ART?
Well, I think the act itself is stigmatized, and so I think particularly among
politicians.
Well, yeah, exactly, particularly among politicians. So I think that's a really difficult prospect in terms of, I think it still gets us back to the same place that we need to be able to talk about sex in a more frank and open way. And I think that's the answer, that's where we start. And in terms of what I would recommend, it's a complicated decision that takes more than 15 minutes in the office. And I'm not sure even necessarily that doctors are always the best suited as the ones to have that question alone, if that's the only option is the only option for people to receive this education. I think if someone is absolutely on a course where condoms are not a reality for them for whatever reason, I think that there's at least a little bit that we can say that this might provide at least a little bit of added benefit for you. I think we can at least say that. Beyond that, I don't think we have the data, and I do think we have to be very careful about how we talk to people.
So now it's time for the audience to jump in and give us your thoughts.